Well, hello and welcome back to our video series on A Layman's Guide to Approaching the Bible. This is part 3 of our video series. I hope you guys are enjoying it, having some fun. I just want to recap a little bit about what we talked about in the second video. We talked about the big picture focus, making sure that we don't have only a big picture focus. That way we can kind of see and understand some of the other important things that God is trying to reveal to us. And we talked about how we can see the big picture being played out. And what I want to focus in on and just emphasize is, I think that the covenant outlook of how the big story plays out is probably the best way. I find it to be the best way. I think it really lays out and builds on itself quite nicely. I was watching a YouTube video from a guy by the name of Dr. Matthew Everhart. And if you've never heard of him, he's a Presbyterian minister. He is a pastor at a church off of Route 8 there in Butler. And he did a video on covenant theology. And I thought he did an excellent job in really making it understandable and just distinguishable between like dispensationalism or other methods. But the way we can look at covenant, how the covenants build and progress the story is Legos. You have kids at home that love Legos. I have 2 girls at home that just absolutely love Legos. I go home, I open the door, I step on Legos all the time. My feet are incredibly in pain right now. But looking at it from the perspective of Legos, right? We can put a block down and then we can put another block on top of that, and we can just keep going, and it keeps building and building and building, getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And that's sort of what covenant theology approach does for us in looking at the big picture. It allows us to see how the story is continually being built up and built up. I hope you're doing well on the challenge I had given you on that, with slowing down and just going through and trying to absorb as much of this information as you possibly can, rewinding, taking some time to just focus in on particular aspects that might be a little confusing. But don't worry, if you still haven't gotten something, if you still haven't quite understood something, don't worry about it. It's okay. I'm not a professional here, so feel free to do this at home anytime you like. It's fine. But you can ask questions. You can come to me and approach me and ask questions. I'm sure Monica is more than happy to answer your questions. I would even say go pick on Mike or Pastor Will. Go ask them some questions. We don't ask them enough questions. We need to ask them more. So let's go ahead and move on into part 3. So now that we have our methods, now that we have our big picture backdrop understanding, let's start getting into how we can practically begin to approach the historical method of interpreting the Bible. And we're going to do that through an acronym that's called CAPTOR. Now, CAPTOR stands for context, analysis, problems, themes, obligations, and reflection. As we utilize CAPTOR, we want to be able to make specific notes of details that we come across as we read the text. This will help us in allowing the text to say what it is that it wants to say. And the key to properly utilizing CAPTOR is being disciplined and reading slowly. I'm really pushing. I'm pushing. This is the one example where it's okay to push, okay? Read slowly, right? You got to read slowly. Approach these things slowly. It's difficult, I know, but it's really important. We got to approach things slowly. So let's look at the first part of CAPTOR, which is context. We can look at things from literary context, right? Where we're looking at words, sentences, paragraphs, and or chapters that surround and relate to a particular text that we're looking at. So just like in that example from video 1 with Colossians 1:15, right? We looked at how somebody who pulls from the text will go to passages like 16 and then 17, and then maybe they'll go to related passages in other books of the Bible, not just in the same testament, but going into the other testament. So if you're in the New Testament, you can go to the Old, or if you're in the Old, you can go to the New, to try to help inform your understanding of what's being said. Well, that's how we build a literary context. And the literary context looks at the text by itself, and it allows the text to build on itself by allowing surrounding verses and chapters to reveal its meaning. And as we look at this, we can begin to see themes being developed by those surrounding texts and throughout repeated words and phrases that occur in those passages. So let's look at an example of this, right? We're going to look at Ruth chapter 4, verse 14, where it says, "Then the women said to Naomi, 'Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a redeemer, and may his name be renowned in Israel.'" So if we're looking at just this text, we kind of get this idea that the Lord is a provider to Naomi, who is providing a redeemer, and we know this to be Boaz, as we'll see here later. But let's go ahead and let's look at some other verses around this text to kind of get a better context of what's being talked about here. So, oh man, I know you might be looking at this and you're going, oh geez, you're having flashbacks of Mrs. Smith. She's grading your tests. There's red all over the place. You probably have, if you're like me, you probably have nightmares like this where you're back in school and all you're seeing is red all over the place. Don't worry about it. It's okay. This red is okay, because I want to just highlight here how in Ruth chapter 4, verses 1 through 8, we begin to see repeated words and phrases such as redeemer. And in these 8 verses, we actually have the repetition of this word occurring, I think, about 12 times. And so as we look at this, we're beginning to see the theme being pounded to us is redeemer, 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 right? And we learn that Boaz is the redeemer to Ruth and Naomi, right? So we can look at these passages and we see the repeated words and variations of the term redeemer. We see it happening all over the place. And from this, we can determine that the theme of the Lord providing redemption is being developed. So we can see the theme coming at us as we look at these repetitive words. So now let's look at an example of historical context. So we looked at how you can take an approach of literary context. And in that literary context, we can also look at things like, what's the genre being described here? Is it poetic? Is it narrative? Is it discourse? All of those things are going to inform how literary context is established. But now let's take a different approach and look at historical context. So when we look at historical context, we want to look at the culture, the customs, the languages, beliefs, and history of not only the author, but also of the original audience. So when you come across one of the epistles of Paul, maybe one of the questions you're going to ask yourself is, okay, who's the author here? It's Paul, but who is it that Paul is talking to? Being able to identify that is actually extremely important when we want to establish what the historical context may be. So another way of looking at historical context is by studying all aspects of the author and the audience's culture that provides insight into details that we find in the text. To better understand historical context, we will need to seek help from sources other than the Bible, such as those handy tools and references I talked about in video 1, where you have maps or concordances or commentaries. They can all help us in establishing historical context. So to help guide us in our research into the historical context, we can look at things from 6 basic questions. And this is actually something I do with my kids in my kids' church class on Sunday mornings. I actually go through whatever particular passage or story in the Bible we're focusing on. I actually write these 6 questions on the board, and I try to get the kids to help me to answer these 6 questions. And these will be really useful to us as we're doing our devotional time as well. So those 6 questions are who, what, when, where, why, and how, right? Pretty simple. So let's just go through an example of how we can utilize answering these 6 questions. Now, don't worry. You aren't going to always be able to answer all 6 questions in any given passage, but it's just a good idea that as you're going through a study, just grab a piece of paper, write these 6 questions down, and just try to answer them to the best of your ability. But let's go ahead and look at 1 Samuel 17 as an example. Now the Philistines gathered their armies for battle, and they were gathered at Soka. I'm probably butchering that. If I butcher words, please forgive me. I'm horrible. Some of you seminary snobs out there are just, you're ready to really pound me on this. But, and they were gathered at Soka, which belongs to Judah, and encamped between Soka and Azekah in Ephes Damim. That is a mouthful. I want you guys to say those three places 5 times fast. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered and encamped in the valley of Elah, and drew up in line of battle against the Philistines. And the Philistines stood on the mountain on the one side, and Israel stood on the mountain on the other side, with a valley between them. So let's try to answer a few of our questions here. What's happening in the text? The people of Israel are preparing to have battle with the Philistines, right? They're going to have a conflict. Stuff is going to go down, and it's not going to be pretty. Next question, when is this taking place? Well, if we look at the text, no specific date is mentioned. However, the book is presumed to have been written in stages until presumably having been finalized in the late 10th century BC. And I know that because I used one of my helpful tools, my study Bible, and I went to the introductory part where it has a date, and it talks about the date of the book, and that's where I got it from. Next, let's look at question where. Where is this taking place? Well, we know from the text that it's in the valley of Elah between Soka and Azekah. So there's just an example of really simple, right? We don't have to make this any more complicated than what it already is. Let's just keep it short, simple, to the point. Let's just try to answer direct questions to the best of our ability. And again, in that part there, I didn't have all 6 questions written down there because maybe those 6 questions like how, you can formulate your own questions based on how to try to get something meaningful if you want to. Like when I did that, I said, what is happening in the text? You could phrase it like, what are the Philistines doing in the text? What is Israel doing in the text? You could try to narrow it down and get more specific so that your study notes get more and more detailed as you go. So my recommendation and my challenge as you're doing and implementing this is try to start with a very broad version of your question, like what is happening in the text? Very broad, very simple, right? And then after you answer that, maybe take it a little bit further. What is this person doing in the text? What is that person doing in the text? What happens as a result of what happened in the text, right? These are all different ways that as we ask these kinds of questions, we begin to gain more and more insight into things. And then we also actually open up other questions that we come across that we didn't know to ask beforehand. And so that's when we're able to then go into other outside biblical sources to try to answer those questions. Maybe this particular question, like, when is this taking place? It wasn't in the text as I was reading it. So I had to go outside of the scripture to try to get a better idea of when this is happening. And so you can do this frequently and with any text that you're looking at. Again, just start very broad and then get very, very specific as time goes. So that's enough with dealing with context in this video. That finishes our part 3. I think we're on part 3 already. And so I hope this was beneficial to you guys. And again, my challenge is, again, start very broad with your questions and then try to get just a little bit more detailed. Just dig down a little bit more as you go. And you'll find that the more that you do this, the easier it becomes, and it just becomes second nature. And before too long, maybe you're going to be asking questions that none of us have ever thought about before, right? So thanks, guys. I appreciate it. And I look forward to seeing each of you in the next one.